Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time this afternoon, Michael. I actually genuinely really appreciate it. And I read the book and I thought it was so interesting. As I said in my comments to you, that one minute I was laughing about the equivalent of 50 tower blocks built under London just so that super rich don't have to go to public cinemas.
Well, this is a great bugbear of mine, because some of my friends live in very wealthy areas like Chelsea, and they're quite elderly people in their 80s, and their lives are basically made hell because the neighbours decide to put a swimming pool or cinema underneath the house next door. So you have a year of massive construction trucks and earth moving equipment working away in the house next door to you. And if you're very noise sensitive, as most of my friends are, and are trying to write books or do stuff, they live in a nightmare, because these selfish people are just excavating, but they basically don't want to go to a public swimming pool or sit next to people in a public cinema, which is, to my mind, part of the experience. They want a basement. So it's like a horrible nightmare.
Yeah, and I think it's well published at the moment that, the London housing market is the only thing that's increased in value during COVID, and it is unsustainable. So that was something that was quite funny to read about, but also, quite harrowing in some sense. But yeah, there was some great facts in the book, especially in the opening chapter. But one thing that you do speak about more generally is the effects of mass media on stoking emotions among populations. I think the word anger came up quite a few times. And I just wondered, in your opinion, to what extent do you feel the mass media has had a role to play in the rise of populism in recent decades?
I think they bear a very heavy responsibility. In the book, I actually talk not just about tabloid newspapers and the rest of it, but also particularly talk radio, which to me is a very sinister phenomenon, and it's cheap to make, and that's why it's ubiquitous. And that plays a role, I think, in basically constantly restoking anger. I mean, anger is quite, unless you're the sort of person who suffers from road rage or trolley rage in the supermarket, anger is not a constant thing. Most of us can lose our tempers and whatever, but to go around being constantly angry is psychologically not normal. And the mass media, I think, has a big role in actually constantly throwing fuel onto the what would otherwise peter out and die out, the flames of anger, and just constantly regenerating it. And they do it time and again over every issue. And there's never a pause for reflection or to think rationally about something. It's just this constant stoking up of emotion. And then the other thing, of course, not just social media contributes to this, but for example, the comments that readers put under newspapers, which I find quite, I mean, I never read the ones they put on things I write, but if you look at what they write under other ones, and they're basically escalating it among themselves. They're fueling it, if you look at a site like, which I don't look at very much, but the sort of political gossip site Guido Fawkes in this country, which, it's a combination of gossip. It's a very Brexity operation. When you look at what the people are posting, say if they've all come back from the pub and they're watching BBC Question Time at 10:30 or 10:45 or whatever, the comments they put on there are semi-psychotic. And if one of the guests happens to be, say, Diane Abbott, who's female and black, then it's unbelievable what they write. I mean, I would prosecute them personally, but that's what's happening. This is the world we've created, and it's totally pernicious. So were one to be looking for solutions to this, which I think we ought to be doing, it's one thing to analyse and say, well, this is the problem. It would actually, something has to be done to break the stranglehold on the media that these organisations have, and to create alternative outlets for people. So, for example, I've got very interested in sites like Open Democracy, which my friend Peter Oborne writes for, or Byline Times, which I, in a modest way, contribute to financially, and which is one of the few places doing serious investigative journalism anymore in this country. And that seems to me the only hope, unless, of course, you get a better class of billionaire, which is possible. I mean, look at what Jeff Bezos has done with the Washington Post. I mean, that paper was literally dying. And it looked like, you know, when you used to pick it up in Washington, you didn't exactly rush through the pages to read it. And by just putting in what to him must be a trivial amount of money, he's turned it into a massively successful and very serious newspaper. I mean, when I want to read coverage of British politics, I look in the Washington Post, because they'll do it better than most British newspapers. I mean, it's a terrific newspaper, seriously. And that's just because he's got so much money. And then, of course, he wanted to crusade against Donald Trump. You know, that was really something that pushed his buttons. And he turned it into a terrifically critical paper during the Trump years. That's what you've got to have, either sort of benevolent billionaires or grassroots operations like Byline Times.
I was about to say, because you do speak about the benevolent force of, sorry, not benevolent, sorry, the malevolent force of billionaires who sort of fund these kind of talk radio things and present themselves as not part of the elite, and that they speak for the sort of general man, woman. And so I just wonder, sorry, this is just a personal question that's just come out of what we're discussing, is there's no way to regulate that then? Like, free speech is free speech, isn't it? So it's like, there's absolutely no way that we could eliminate one bad force if we don't stop the good, you know, Jeff Bezos of the world having that influence on mass media. So I feel like there really isn't a solution to
well, he's got it.
Right.
Well, I mean, he's obviously got critics, because Amazon, you know, many people think Amazon is a really terrible employer and very exploitative, which I'm sure it probably is. You know, I wouldn't want to work in an Amazon warehouse. But on the other hand, unless one's sort of, you know, naive, something which appears to be bad, or somebody who you criticize on one thing, can actually be on the side of the angels on another thing. I mean, that's it. I mean, America is very different, of course, from Europe, because there's virtually absolute free speech in the United States. You know, under the Second Amendment, is it? Is it the Second Amendment?
It's the First Amendment. Second Amendment's to bear arms.
Sorry, yes. Well, there's a mistake I shouldn't make. Anyway, the First Amendment, they have virtually guaranteed free speech. But here there have been various attempts to try and regulate the press, notably Levinson, but it's been pretty disastrous, and the regulators are quite toothless. And I can't really see that in a way happening. It's much more, what I'm talking about is much more that you'd have to somehow persuade people that it was in their interest to read a more informed and critical press. It's a difficult thing to do, but I don't think it's impossible. You know, and there is a certain amount of I mean, as you can see from the declining circulation of every newspaper, that, you know, look at the circulation figures in UK Press Gazette. You know, these people's business model clearly isn't working. And there's just you know, every newspaper in this country this year has suffered a double-digit decline in circulation. And I noticed going around, I mean, I live in central London, I noticed going around, and the sheer number of, like, not newsagents, but mini marts and corner shops which no longer even have newspapers in them, because it's the economics of it don't stack up for the people who own the shop. You know, it's a bulky commodity. It weighs a lot. You have to get up at the crack of dawn to bring the papers into the shop, and then what do you then have to send back the ones you don't sell, and it's just not a, you know, you can earn far more money selling tins of canned drink or sweets. It's just not.
No, it's true. I do think as well, something that's plaguing the journalism industry, media in general, is just sort of headlines, you know, and where people just read the headlines, they don't actually click on the article. There's no, like, interrogation of the facts in the headlines. So you have people like, you know, the Daily Mail, who in the UK are quite famous for stoking up anger on certain topics, just have these sensationalist headlines. People read it. That's all.
Well, also what's, you know, what is also very glaringly obvious is that sometimes the headline bears no relationship then to the article which comes after it, because it's all been said in the headline, and the article actually then doesn't substantiate the headline. They've just pushed the story way beyond what it would actually bear
Mm.
in the headline. I mean, the classic case, which isn't in my book, but where various Tory, sort of quite liberal Tory ministers and MPs were accused of treasonous dealings with the European Union. You know, this was some sort of insinuation, and that was a big headline. But in fact, there was no way that any of that stacked up. It just couldn't be factually demonstrated. So just the headline claimed these people like Philip Hammond or whatever, or David Galt, were traitors, and it said that. But there was nothing in the follow-up article which backed up what was in the headline. I mean, it's just outrageous.
It's outrageous. It is outrageous.
It's outrageous.
But on the sort of feelings of emotion then, so anger is one big part of sort of the emotions behind populist movements. But you also speak in the book about the idealization of rural villages and populations.
Yeah.
You say that this goes beyond recognition of what we actually know things to be these days. And this is due to a heavy dose of sentimentalism.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you could elaborate a bit more on those sort of themes of nostalgia and romanticism and how they're pertinent. Yeah.
I mean, just before I forget, to come back to the anger thing. I mean, not all anger is necessarily malevolent. I mean, for example, you know, if I was an African-American civil rights activist in the 1960s or 70s, I would feel, you know, I would think they have every right to feel very angry about a lot of issues, just as people are currently very angry about the Republicans' attempt to rig the election system in Georgia. You know, these are things you could be quite righteously angry about. And I think there's nothing wrong with feeling angry. But to come on to the other thing, which is that there is a huge element of, look, basically we haven't really ever said what populism is, and it's boring to go down that path, but there's something that a very senior US judge said when somebody asked him what pornography was, and his answer was, "I know it when I see it," which I think is a great response. And I sort of feel that about populism. I sort of know it when I see it. So we don't need to define it, I guess. But part of it is obviously defining, you know, the real people against self-interested, globalized or whatever elites who are in some way rendered unreal, as indeed is everybody who doesn't support the so-called real people. So, for example, if you voted Remain in the 2016 referendum, you might as well be invisible nowadays, because all the policy is designed to placate and cater to the so-called real people, not you. You know, this is just an incredible anti-democratic way of approaching politics. You know, to pretend that 48% of the population don't effectively exist. So I find that utterly amazing. And of course, the so-called real people are being sentimentalized out of all recognition. So nobody really points to the fact that a lot of these populist parties are supported by people who, for most of their life, actually couldn't even be bothered to vote. When I was interested in this Romanian AUR party, because a lot of their voters are first-time voters. Likewise, a lot of the people who voted in the Brexit referendum had never voted in their lives, and the Vote Leave campaign identified who they were and mobilised them to vote. So that's the first thing. And second thing you never point out is that most of them are woefully uneducated. I mean, that's a very glaring characteristic of most populist parties, that they have a lot of people with very elementary education. And yet you're asking them to express a view about something like, you know, leaving or not leaving the European Union, which is highly technical. You have to know something to express a view on it. Do you see what I mean? And you can see this has happened already in things like, I mean, I happen to know about this, having served on a jury once, that complex city fraud cases are dealt with by judges because 12 ordinary people could not possibly get their head round it. They don't understand it. You could explain it to them 100 times and they wouldn't get it. I mean, a lot of them, the jury I sat on a long time ago, a lot of the evidence was about mobile phone mast data, you know, where particular criminals had been. And 3 people on the jury, you could have told them that 50 times what was going on and shown them diagrams. They could not get it. So let's not be too. When I say I don't like this sort of you know, people, some of my, in fact, some of my colleagues at LSE would say, well, I'm a dreadful snob and I'm being cruel to these people, etc. Well, tough, you know, yes, I am going to be. And we've also seen this, of course, with the, you know, in the post-Brexit aftermath, this extraordinary sentimentalization of fishermen. I find this utterly extraordinary. They are insignificant to the economy of this country. They catch something that most people in this country don't eat. If you go down to Newquay, which I have done, and gone to a fish market, you look bewildered because there's no boxes of fish. And the guys in the market will say, yeah, that's because they're on those huge refrigerated trucks driving back to the Channel ferry or whatever to go over to Spain, where people do eat fish. A lot of it.
No, and I agree. I do agree on the fisherman point, and I think that speaks highly to your notions of idealizing parts of the population.
Yeah.
The thing I just maybe like to comment on is the uneducated side, which I agree can be very emotive. It's definitely something that's divisive on like both sides of the political spectrum. But isn't it just more of a, it's obviously a massive condemnation of incumbent political elite rhetoric, whatever you want to call it, that has genuinely forgotten about these people. And if you are like a bit uneducated or whatever the word you'd like to use, then you probably have been left behind in quite a lot of sort of social mobility aspects. And therefore it's actually quite a testament to populist leaders and populist ideology who have found something that sparks that, even if it may be anger and it may be against a complete falsehood and an imagined enemy, they've sparked that, you know, passion in them to vote and to be first-time voters and to want to change something.
No, I say that in the book, that
you do.
If you're a Democrat, you can't possibly object to the fact that people vote in, you know, voting in larger numbers than otherwise, and it's very good that people go out and vote. I think the point I'm making is maybe a slightly different one. That what's going on is that, you know, for example, the European Union is being blamed for things that the European Union has got nothing to do with whatsoever. So the neglect of, say, coastal communities in Britain or parts of the, you know, the wasteland that is the deindustrialized north in this country, or the problems of Cornwall, you know, peripheral Cornwall, etc., and nothing to do with the EU. In fact, if you go to these places, you'll often see a sort of one of those blue, you know, EU flags outside a very modern hospital, which they've contributed to building, or a new bridge or something. So they're not the people who are at fault here. These are failures of central government policy in nation states. They've made the decision to do this, and they are the ones who all leapt enthusiastically at, you know, the whole lot, all the effects of globalization, and which, you know, there's a very good French historical geographer called Christophe Guy, I think his name is, who showed that the benefits of globalization in France were, you know, they were very evident in about a dozen towns and cities, but then the rest of it didn't benefit from it at all. You know, it very much was focused on particular groups of people. And of course there is, you know, since I don't get a very bleeding heart about the uneducated or whatever, I really can't. There is also a sense in which, let's not forget, there might well be a lot of resentment. I mean, I talk in the book, you know, I don't like making historical analogies very much, but one thing which is glaringly apparent to me as a historian is that in the 1930s, there was a lot of rural or small town resentment about Red Berlin, Red Vienna, Red Madrid. These were conspicuously left-wing cities and quite cosmopolitan. And this is, if I had a penny for every person in the north of England who's immediately started, you know, slagging off London and as this sort of massive incubus in this country, I would be a very rich man. And there is a lot of resentment towards the lifestyle of people in London. I don't just mean that it's relatively more tolerant about gays or same-sex marriage or whatever. It's not just that. It's about our general lifestyle and the sheer abundance of stuff around most, at least the middle class in these cities, never mind the very wealthy. And I think a lot of this is quite driven by resentment towards, you know, the capital cities. I'm sure it is. And then something I also talk about, which is again common to lots of populist movements, that they seem to thrive best in what the Poles call Polska B, in other words, Poland out in the sticks. And they have suffered huge depopulation. I mean, somebody once said that these countries had gone, particularly Hungary actually, had gone from being red to grey overnight. So you're speaking as a man with totally white hair, that you're left with a semi-senescent population, and all the young dynamic people have gone somewhere else. And this is just, that's what it is. But it's not irreversible. I mean, for example, Ireland has had some success in repatriating a lot of its young people who went abroad, when the Irish economy effectively collapsed and the housing market collapsed. They've all gone back now because there's lots of jobs. But I think you can blame a lot of exogenous forces when actually it's the people who you've elected to be in power in your own country who are most at fault.
Yeah. I am, as a Russian focus, it was quite a big thing in sort of like the Yeltsin era, and especially, during the really, really rocky 90s, there was this yearning for the past, the Brezhnev era, which we all know now was just stagnation and pretty much lining up the Soviet Union to collapse. However, people just felt like they had then. So do you think that the populist side of it needs to be a combination of anger towards what they feel they're missing, combined with the nostalgia of what they believe that they once had and could have again?
Yeah, and also, yes, I mean, nostalgia, that's a very interesting way of putting it, that in a way it's a vision of a past which is never coming back. I mean, I point out in the book one thing, you can say, oh, life in villages is very nice and everything, maybe it is, maybe it was back in the 1950s, I wasn't really there. But, nowadays, people, villages have got lots of second homeowners who push the prices up. Everybody in your family will have a mobile phone, so you can't lament, families not talking to each other at the dinner table. I mean, I've had people in my house come around to dinner with their children, and the children just go off into a sort of electronic, and they're quite unself-conscious about it. Do you see what I mean? They're living in a totally different world. So the idea of almost like a sort of old-fashioned version of the Archer's idea of a village is nonsense. That world doesn't exist, and people in villages get stuff delivered by Amazon couriers just as much as anybody else does. So if that's the case, then there won't be a village shop. The infrastructure of the village will collapse, or the post office will take an economic decision. Well, we're not going to have a village. We're not going to have village post offices, and then banks, particularly banks, actually just shut down all the bank branches and say, well, you can bank in the post office, but then the post office is closed. So all of this is a process of change, which again, it's happening, and you cannot freeze the world as it was back in 1950. You can't.
No, completely. No, I completely agree. My final question on this sort of topic, I really am interested in it. Sorry, Michael, I know we keep talking about it before we move on to Britain and Russia. You speak quite a lot about the AfD in Germany.
Yeah.
I know that German sort of history in general is your area of expertise. And I think Germany presents a really interesting case when it comes to populism, because it's different to sort of regions that maybe I speak about when I talk about sort of post-Soviet states that had the whole system collapse and therefore had a whole country go into transition towards sort of democracy. Whereas you had a split country who was already half, westernized, and then the other half, obviously it fell. And I just wonder if you think that maybe the AfD or East Germany in general is on like a different path of populism, and maybe the trajectory isn't as linear as we're seeing in like America, like it's just like a rise against an establishment, whereas in East Germany it could just be like a genuine anger, because there are genuine disparities between a country that was ruled separately.
Well, yeah, and also there's a whole sort of psychological, in a way that regime it was cradled to grave and quite comforting in that sense. So it's very easy to give it a tinge of a rosy tint, 20 years after or 30 years after it's collapsed. But then, the other thing about it is that the collapse of communism, in a sense, deranged a lot of say, gender roles. So in communist countries, you know, the apex, not predator, but the apex person was the heavy industrial worker, you know, a male typically working in a coal mine or, you know, whatever, steelworks or something. And then, of course, all that went completely down the tubes once, you know, the country was assimilated into West Germany. So that leaves a lot of males who are effectively functionless. You know, what are they going to do? And you can't reconfigure them as high-tech workers or something. It's too late for people over a certain age. So they make up really a core constituency for the AfD, but also, of course, for Die Linke, which is the sort of post-communist reincarnation of the old Socialist Unity Party, with a lot of add-on, very radical West Germans into it as well. So, but I suspect that that's pretty, you know, that the German government could do a lot more than it has done, not just pump money in and think, you know, that's the answer to everything. I think they could have done more to integrate people. And it must be, I mean, rather like Russia, actually, it must be very galling to have a lot of flash guys in suits rock up in town telling you how to organize your lives and your economy and carrying out very radical strategies and policies which mess up your life. It must be intensely demoralizing and make you very angry. I mean, we've seen, you know, with Russia, obviously that was the case. People just rocked up and defrauded people out of their little packets of shares with a jar of gherkins or something and a bottle of vodka. And then they ended up owning a giant steel empire or aluminium empire or whatever. We shall name no names.
It is shocking. It is shocking.
It is
There's that
very
famous Boris Berezovsky quote, who obviously he passed away, and he said that in the 90s, he said there are 7 men who control Russia, and I am one of them.
Yeah, no, I know.
Shocking.
And if you look into I mean, he was a complete crook in my opinion, but if you look into their backgrounds, I mean, there is one very famous person whose business career, well, I think first of all, he started off selling plastic ducks for children's baths, but then after a whole trainload of oil disappeared one night somewhere in Siberia, he became a millionaire overnight and has never looked back. But
no. Interesting. On that note of Russia, you have a chapter dedicated to Britain and Russia and their relations.
Yeah.
And we spoke about that in the beginning before we started the interview. But you spoke, it was quite interesting. It was more on the note of building and falling of empires. Mm-hmm. And I think you actually quite explicitly mentioned Putin and his admiration for populists who have been not populists, sorry, just for leaders who have been state building autocrats.
Yeah.
And so my question would be, can we ever separate nationalism and patriotism from populism? Because obviously state building, but being an autocrat are two very different things. And I just wondered if we can build our nation and be proud of our history as Russia is claiming to do, without practicing othering or being populist or damaging political stability.
Well, the reason I wrote that chapter, which might seem a bit eccentric in a book like this, but I thought it was quite essential, was that both Britain and Russia share one very fundamental characteristic, which was that they were both very big empires, one sea-based, one land-based. But the deal was, if you like, that the dominant nationality suppressed its own identity in favor of other people's. So, you know, the English suppressed their English identity, which is part of the problem we're going through now, because it's certainly come back with a vengeance. Likewise, the ethnic Russians suppressed their identity in favor of this sort of polyglot, you know, more cosmopolitan identity that went with the Soviet Union. So, you know, in that sense, both countries are rather similar. And what you've seen is a resurgence of, you know, an English and a Russian identity after the collapse of empire. That's what I think is going on. And then both have always been slightly adjacent from continental Europe throughout their history. And, you know, I compare them nowadays, I mentioned this to you before, but I think they're becoming rather like sort of, imagine that you're in a house in the middle of 2 other houses. and that's the EU house, where you've now got two crazy neighbours on either side who are shouting over the fence at you, saying, I wish your house would be flooded or collapse from a plague of termites, or, you know, this, that and the other. So actually, paradoxically, they're starting to sound rather similar. And to my horror, when you look at the British tabloid press and then compare it with some of the Russian press, you might as well just, you know, translate the stuff and it could appear quite happily in one or the other. Now, and also, of course, you know, if I was in Central or Eastern Europe, I would be slightly worried, moreover, by the latest, you know, attempt to define a type of post-Brexit British identity, because there's all this stuff about global Britain, which effectively means spreading Britain's limited resources far too thinly. But I can't see any way in which the British are going to continue to be deeply committed to the security of the Baltic states or Romania or whatever. That's just not going to happen. I mean, they might have 800 soldiers in Estonia right now, but I don't think, you know, that's not going to be the future, because they're talking all the time about venturing into places, you know, to contain or confront the Chinese. So this is going to have some, I mean, I've had this conversation with a Polish think tank guy called, or come journalist, when I was at the Raciu thing in Transylvania, and he said that is a very big concern, you know, for some people in Poland, that we're going to inevitably, our attention is going to drift away. And if you look at how Britain, I mean, Britain is currently chair of the G7 for the next few months. It's very conspicuous, at least to Europeans, that the British spend half their time in the G7 effectively defining themselves against the EU by just subtle digs and differences, as if the EU, which they call the organisation, incidentally, they refer to it as the organisation, that organisation. So they actually all the time are defining themselves now against the EU. That's what they do.
Right.
And that's going to be the nature. I have a horrible feeling that because it's so useful in mobilising a support base for the Conservatives, that animosity towards the EU is going to be around for a very long time to come here, and it's going to get worse.
And I'm in no way trying to compare or affiliate the Conservatives with populism. However,
oh no, I mean, well, no, I mean, unfortunately, that is precisely what happened. I mean, I can give you a very good analogy, which caused outrage in the people that I was referring to when I did it on Radio 4's Today programme one morning about 2 months ago. If you imagine, do you know anything about African hybridized bees? Do you know about them?
Unfortunately, I don't.
Well, look, basically, if you take a European honeybee and you transplant it to Africa or, say, Brazil or somewhere, it dies because it's too hot. But somehow or other, scientists in the 50s or 60s crossed European bees with some species of African bees, and you end up with a hybridized African bee. Okay. Now, this is an invasive species. It's very aggressive. And so, for example, when a European honeybee decides to chase you, it gives up after 50 yards. These guys chase you for 500 yards or more. Oh, and European bees sting you maybe up to about 1,000 of them might attack you, which would kill you, admittedly, it really would. These things attack in up to 500,000 bees. So you've got no chance, you're dead. Now, what happened, I think, to both the Republicans in the States via the Tea Party, who are my Africanized bees, they infiltrated the Republican Party and denatured it. So now it's one of the most extreme parties on the planet. I mean, the National Rally in France seems moderate compared to the US Republican Party. Believe me, it is. And likewise, the Conservative Party were infiltrated by lots of Brexity type people and took it over. And then they systematically, just as the Republicans had done, they deselected and kicked out any moderate or more liberal people. So, that certainly happened here, where they took the whip away from 20, quite liberal, reasonable Conservatives like Philip Hammond and all the rest of them. And then you end up with a party which is indistinguishable from UKIP. And that is what it is. It's
Yeah.
greater UKIP.
You did put a really, really good comment in the book about how obviously Boris Johnson's sort of cabinet is filled with loyalists to the Brexit cause
Yeah.
at the expense of being good politicians. You know, they're sort of
Yeah,
third-rate, ministers,
yeah.
which is a
It's
shame. But
sole criteria for being in the cabinet. It's not it's not competence. I mean, most of them are fools, to be quite frank about it. It's not competence. I mean, how could you possibly have Gavin Williamson as education secretary? In what world would he be education secretary? But it's because these people actually have very definite views about Brexit. And what's really disgraceful is that some of them, like Liz Truss, you know, were fervent supporters of the European Union and wanted us to remain in it, and have now wrapped themselves quite literally in the flag. I mean, whenever you see political broadcasts or interviews nowadays, there's so many Union Jacks in the back. I mean, I wonder why they don't just, you know, wear Union Jack suits or dresses, get it over with, you know, appear in a Jack shirt, or why have just the flags? You could wear. And this is a very sinister, un-British development. You know, all these flags around you. I mean, I find this incredibly sinister, personally.
Yeah, it is. I must admit, I obviously did vote in the referendum and didn't get the outcome I hoped, but it has been a shocking fallout. And that does lead me on to my next question, actually. We've spoken quite a bit about Europe, and it's hard to find some positives at the moment of future relations. But I'm wondering, do you think Europe can ever heal from the wounds of Brexit? And I don't just mean sort of in relation to its future relationship with the UK. I also mean sort of about restoring faith in the union internally, in those countries like Poland and Hungary, and now even Romania, as you mentioned, and Germany especially. You did mention in your book that the German courts are waging against the ECJ and EU rulings on the joint liability bond issues for the coronavirus.
That's because Bernd Lucke, who was one of the economists who an academic economist who founded the AfD, it started off basically as a very nerdy group of economists, and you know, there's not many votes in that. So then eventually in 2015, it ran with the migrant issue, where there's a lot more votes in the migrant issue than there is about the single currency or the single market. So in a way, he was sort of replaced and reverted to being a type of Eurosceptic economist. Now it's him who's bringing the case against the recovery fund in the the German Constitutional Court. So it's, you know, it's down to him, that move. But
right.
I mean, the thing that probably came very close to really wrecking the EU, I would have said in recent times, is actually the whole vaccine crisis. You know, that had the EU not actually stepped in to centralise procurement of vaccines, what you would have had would be the part of the world that interests you would have been too poor to buy the vaccines. I mean, had they not centrally taken over procurement and negotiated a price, etc., they would have, you know, countries in Eastern Europe or the Baltic would not have had vaccines. So there was a very good reason to do it. And you can see how, you know, when it's a matter of life and death, literally, you can see how this could have been a real existential moment for the EU in a way that some of the earlier crises have not been. I mean, I think this could have been really bye-bye time for it. You know, it could have broken up about it. So they've survived that. And, you know, to their credit also, they're not engaging in, you know, crude vaccine nationalism with the British. They're quite rightly, in my opinion, pointing to the deficiencies of a single multinational company, AstraZeneca, which incidentally, I noticed the Swedes have gone very quiet about AstraZeneca, even though they co-own it. You know, they don't seem to talk a lot about AstraZeneca. And, you know, it's a multinational company whose boss is a dual French and Australian citizen. I don't know whether you know that.
I did not know that, no.
And they clearly decided that they would sign up, you know, contracts left, right and centre, knowing full well that they didn't actually have the productive capacity to deliver. And then they must have made the calculation that if they broke the contract with the British, they would end up in real serious legal trouble in a very sophisticated legal system, and they gambled that that was a risk they weren't going to take, so they shortchanged the Europeans, who, again, to their credit, have been exporting vaccines in large numbers. We haven't exported vaccines at all. And you can see this. Take Canada. Canada is a very interesting case because just over the border from Canada to America, there is a giant Pfizer plant. It's an American company, Pfizer. And yet not one dose of vaccine has gone, because Biden is practicing a America First vaccine policy, not one dose of vaccine has gone to Canada. Canada gets its vaccines from Europe. We're exporting vaccines to them. We're not the British, but the European, the EU is. So this is just an extreme, you know, I think in a way, I mean, the EU's been on the side of the angels on this one. And actually the real villain is, you know, a multinational company, and they don't care about national borders or this, that, and the other. They care about making money.
True. Yeah,
so
very true.
I would blame AstraZeneca for a lot of this. And anyway, what's going to happen is that by the summer, the rate at which the EU countries are vaccinating their population will have caught up with America or Britain, and then the whole issue will just dissipate and go away. That's what I think.
Right. And you do think maybe from that point that Europe can heal from the wounds of Brexit? It can heal from this just back and forth, because it's got quite bitter over the vaccine situation.
No, well, in a way, it's very asymmetric because the British are obsessed about the EU, and despite having left the EU, our newspapers are full. If you look at the Daily Telegraph or something, it is full every day with nonsense about the EU's going to fall apart, or they're messing up this or messing up that. It goes on and on and on. Whereas if you look at a French or German newspaper, they're not writing about the British. You know, it's a done thing, and they've moved on to other issues, like, I don't know, their relations with Turkey is a big theme at the moment. You know, their relationship with Biden and the United States, that's a big theme. A collective response to Russia, a collective response to China. These are the things which will be animating the EU. Where I do think it's got a problem as an organisation, and I'm not a sort of professional PR person, but I think they need to get out much more, out and about, to make a positive case for themselves. You see, before the Brexit referendum, I mean, Jean-Claude Juncker, who in my opinion is an extremely much abused man. I really rather like him, and I think he's a very wily man, and certainly a far better caliber of politician than Ursula von der Leyen, whose whole career is a series of failures, but never mind, fail upwards in her case. You know, Juncker said he would come to Britain and talk on television or be interviewed and talk about the EU. And of course, Cameron said, oh, no, I don't think you should do that, because the British press had basically stereotyped him as a fall-down drunk.
Right, yeah.
But actually, he's an incredibly, I've watched interviews with him quite recently on the BBC, and he's an incredibly articulate, very reasonable man who anybody sensible might want to listen to. And I just think the EU's quite bad in getting out and telling people, you know, telling people what it's about and what it does do and maybe what it doesn't do.
Yeah. But that comes back to the mass media thing that we spoke about in the beginning, you know, with stoking and keeping the anger.
Yeah.
So I'm just, I don't know where we go from here then, to be honest. If the EU, as you say, would be ready to heal, and I do agree with your points, but then obviously if the Tory party's raison d'etre has become to be against the European Union, then the papers such as the Telegraph or the Mail, they will forever, you know, keep that anger alive.
Yes, they will, but on the other hand, they don't have control of what goes on in the EU countries. So, I mean, I've been rather heartened by the appointment of Mario Draghi as Italian Prime Minister. And one of the very interesting things that's happened as a result of that is that two of the most Eurosceptic parties in the Italian political system, which is the Five Star Movement for one reason or another, and the Lega, you know, the Salvini people, they've both joined his government, along with about 8 technocrats, and both of them have completely dialed down their hostility towards the European Union. Both parties. that, you know, the only party now left in opposition effectively in Italy is the neo-fascist Fratelli d'Italia and their leader Giorgia Meloni. So, you know, the Italian political system, the pro-European parties have actually, you know, there's a great deal more pro-European sentiment, particularly since Draghi became prime minister, than has ever been the case. And also, there's another example of it. If you look at the recent Dutch elections, D66, which is the most Europhile party in the Netherlands, they doubled their vote.
Right.
So I don't think it's all doom and disaster by any means.
No. And I will come back to that point at the end. I have a final question.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. No, but it's very, very much on that point. However, I just want to mention, you spoke about historical memory in amongst populist thinking. And I thought there was such a good part about deliberate re-traumatization of populations for political gain. And one of the things that you spoke about was the Holocaust. The Holocaust, which was about obviously the sort of selective historical memory where you know, the Polish population, you even spoke about they made up about the gassing of civilians. Yeah, and it's a way of like absolving them of maybe some of the blame that they had. I just wondered if you could speak about what ways this serves populism's development across Europe, this use of historical memory. And
I mean, I can broaden that out more, maybe some of my earlier arguments, but I always distinguish between myth. You know, all societies going back to the Stone Age have had myths about themselves. They're quite necessary in a way for group cohesion and a sense of, you know, that we're here for more than just grubbing around and breeding and eating. So I've got no problem with myth, but history is a rather different category. And in my book, I mentioned a very famous Cambridge historian who sort of compared historians to like woodworm or something, you know, that we get in the timbers and basically eat our way through. If you imagine the timbers of the myth, we get in there and eat away at the myth. And this is what we do. And, you know, horror of horrors for patriotic populists, every generation we reinterpret the past. You know, we don't all just write the same thing, because otherwise what would be the point of us? We have our own perspectives, our own views, our own approaches, and we reinterpret the stuff and it moves on, and then someone will come along and do it after we're dead, you know, or whatever. Of course they will. It's a perpetual process of reinvestigation. And of course it's also to do with the fact that suddenly, I mean, for example, you know, if you take how the Second World War or the Holocaust has been written about, one of the, you know, major consequences of the fall of the Berlin Wall and of the collapse of communism was that suddenly historians got their hands on, you know, massive tonnages of documents they'd never seen, which were just sitting in Minsk or somewhere or Warsaw, and you'd never had access to it, and boomf, you could rewrite the whole story in a way with a different perspective and shift the whole story that way. So that's all positive. But what I object to is an attempt to sort of freeze history and to say, this is the version we're going to have. These are the good guys, these are the bad guys, which is a quite unsophisticated way of looking at it. We are never going to look at this in any other way. And then there it stops. I mean, I'll give you an example which I've actually had experience of in my own career. You would never be allowed in a British newspaper to write an article which said, well, there's quite a good reason why Britain appeased the Nazis in 1938. Nobody would let you write that piece because appeasement is bad. Now, I'm old enough to have lived through successive British governments saying, oh, no, you know, Nasser in Egypt in the 50s, well, I was probably one then, or younger, Nasser was a Hitler, or, you know, Saddam Hussein was a Hitler, or Gaddafi was a Hitler, and so on and so on, or Galtieri in Argentina was a Hitler, fascist, and we never appease fascists, or we never appease Nazis. Now, actually, in reality, there should have been very good diplomatic solutions to all of the problems that those people were creating. You know, it could have been dealt with in a very different way. But no, partly because we're all obsessed with never appeasing fascists, we ended up in two wars, one in Afghanistan, one one in Iraq, which costs something in the region, when you factor in all the costs of like disability pensions and psychological counselling, it'll cost $6 trillion just to America. That's the bill, the final bill. Never mind about all the tens of thousands of people dead along the way.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's an example where myth has an actually quite pernicious influence on actual policy, because it is not the case that you should just automatically go to war with people, that's your reflexive response. You know, there's plenty of scope for proper diplomacy. That's you know, it's quite essential.
Yeah.
So that's an example of it. So I'm pretty hostile to that type of you know, attempt to. I mean, you see it in this country every day, because, you know, I say this country's now become like the sort of person who writes the date as 1940 in a checkbook. Not that any of us use checkbooks, but you know how when the year changes, you sort of sometimes write the wrong year on a check.
Oh yeah,
I've done
that. Oh
that.
yes.
You know, it's not 2021, it's 2020. Well, there's a type of British conservative for whom it's always 1940. And our media, there's entire channels devoted to the Second World War, effectively. I mean, what world are we living in? I mean, this is, and it all creates a certain psychological atmosphere and a, you know, ridiculous sense that we won the war. We didn't win the war. You know, the Russians lost 24 million people defeating Hitler. The Americans put enormous economic resources into it that you couldn't dream of.
Yeah.
You know, they can turn out a fully functioning bomber in a day off a production line, or a ship. So this idea, this extraordinary sense of entitlement and grandiosity, is just preposterous.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I'm actually reading Why War, which is Christopher Coker's new book as well at the moment. And he also touches on this very point, the sort of myths and the idealization of war has taken on it's like its own character, really. You know, like war is Hollywood within itself.
Yeah.
Just as, you know, like in literature and stuff, I think he spoke about Achilles, you know, been figure. So I completely agree that this myth of the great patriotic war and, you know, historical memory, it does take on a life of its own. But my question would be then, so there's never really going to be an end of populism, is there? There's never going to be an end of people taking advantage of this for...
Well, the Second World War thing, because way back in the early 90s, I made 3 historical television documentaries about different aspects of Nazi Germany. And
is this the one with the birds flying behind you on the boat?
No, that's much later. That's my one failed attempt to present a television program. That was in 2005, and I hated the experience. Now, these were documentaries with no presenters. They were hour-long documentaries, you know, pretty serious stuff. And I remember at the time saying, well, you know, these commissioning editors and TV, they'll get fed up with this subject soon and they'll never want to do it again. This was in about 1990, 91. Well, now it's 2021 and there's more of it on television every night than you could ever consume. It's a bit like television programs about sharks. You know, you switch on any channel and there's going to be sharks. In fact, I watched one last night. It's just become a sort of perennial. You know, it's rather like the Tudors or something. And this is a depressing reflection of our education system, of the lack of imagination. You know, the people who commission these programs are sticking with very well-worn formulas which they know work. They won't take any risks because their bosses won't like it and they'll lose their jobs. And this is all just, you know, I mean, actually in the book I also talk about, you know, another group of villains. Let's not forget these villains, which is television producers, particularly television politics show producers, because the entire thing is set up for maximum polarization, maximum people losing their temper. And that's what they want. That's why Nigel Farage has been on British television so much, although he's a complete con man, in my opinion. But the reason he's on is because he generates controversy. Now, the people making these decisions are not Nigel Farage or the rest of them. This is actually the television producers, and I bet you couldn't name one of them, and I probably couldn't. They're completely anonymous. They are utterly cynical. They are doing it, you know, to generate ratings, audiences, because this works. I mean, why not just forget the discussion and say, look, here's your sword and here's your axe. Why don't you just do it in the studio and we'll have the real thing, you know, sort of real bust up with blood.
Yeah.
Blood always sells. So, but the cynicism of it is just, and the way in which it's almost contrived to frustrate intelligent debate is what I object to about it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think I remember there was a question time where back when the BNP were the party of the moment, Nick Griffin was on there, and I think it was when Jack Straw was Justice Minister or Home Secretary or something. Anyway, and it was one of the most watched question times ever, just because he was on there.
And was Jack on it?
Yeah, Jack Straw was on it.
Because he lives opposite me. He's just about 100 yards. Well, he's not there at the moment. He's in Oxfordshire, but we know each other. We're actually quite good friends.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, he's opposite.
I remember the quote. It was there was a question from the audience to Nick Griffin, and was like, why are you a Holocaust denier? And he says, oh, it's illegal in the EU to even discuss the Holocaust, so I can't say my opinion. And Jack Straw was like, as Justice Minister, I promise you won't get prosecuted. You can justify your point. And there was no substance to it apart from like theatrics, you know, like you speak about. It was the most watched question time. I'm sure there's been more since, but at the time. And people would be under the illusion that Nick Griffin had real sway in British politics. Because he gets the same platform as Jack Straw, but it's just not the case.
No. Well, this is because also there's a sort of pathetic concern with an obsession with political balance in our state broadcaster. You know, they want to always so. For example, if you have a top epidemiologist on television talking about coronavirus, you virtually then have to have some moron who thinks it's resulted from mobile phone masts. It's literally that bad. So, and there are lots of people out there who believe the most crazy things. I mean, there are a lot of people who've got very, very ill-informed, crazy views, and you just have to accept that. And then we have to think, how do we deal with this?
Yeah, no, definitely.
A root and branch reform of the education system might be a good place to start. I'm actually one of the few people. I once surprised a school teacher when I went to talk in a school, because I like going to talk to schools occasionally to keep me grounded in very young people. I've never taught people of that age, but I quite like doing it. And actually, I came to the view that something which is often attacked in conservative papers, i.e. media studies, is a very good thing, because it does teach people to think about how is this produced, this material, who's producing it, how's it done, who's paying for it, and to think much more critically rather than just consuming it like you would a bag of popcorn. You know, that there is a point I began to think, well, this is actually quite sensible to do this.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think journalism's never looked down on, is it? It's like a staple, you know, university course and a great, you know, profession. But media studies, I mean, that's the new medium of communications.
Yeah, exactly. One ought to know about it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think my final question, the reason I wanted to save this for my final question is so we're not leaving on such a not that it's been a sad topic, but there definitely are sad elements to it. Your last chapter deals with the pandemic and how this has been the demise of many populist leaders during the crisis. And you put quite beautifully actually that the politics of populism is maladapted to this pandemic, because it isn't, the pandemic is an enemy that's indiscriminate, you know, and you can't put a face to it. And you speak of Bolsonaro and Trump and Putin has been key in failing at this. Where they have failed in this crisis, and they cannot sort of attach a sinister face to this, do you think that the illiberal wave has finally passed over Europe, something that we've spoken about for a while? Do you think democracy is less fragile now?
I'm not sure. I mean, you know, Matthew Goodwin, who's an apologist for every form of populism that exists, you know, talks about a wave and everything, and it makes it seem ineluctable. And I don't really quite see it as a wave. I think it's much more erratic and episodic, and you have to look at different places, you know, and it comes and it goes. And some of these parties are pretty much, seem to me, to be in decline in some places, but then in others, I mean, we always talked about the Iberian exception, and then boom, you've got Vox Party, who are crazy people in Spain. And likewise, you know, people would have looked at Romania and said, well, look, there's somewhere which doesn't really have a populist party. And yet at the last big election, you've got this AUR party, which pops up out of nowhere, and everybody's catching up to find out who the constituency for it are, although they're very like populists in other countries. So, and you know, if you just take a country like the Netherlands, where there's two populist parties, I mean, neither of them did particularly well in the Dutch elections in March. You know, it wasn't a great success for either of them. So you have to, it's a sort of moving target that you're looking at all the time with it. But some people clearly, you know, the pandemic, I would have said, has finished off Bolsonaro. I can't see he can survive this. I mean, there are literally people dying in the gutter with an empty oxygen tank because they just can't get to a hospital, and there's no ICU treatment available in a hospital. And the fact that in the last week or so that both, you know, the defense minister, the heads of all three army services have just resigned in Brazil on the ground that they don't want to get dragged into, because he's constantly threatening coups and talking about coups. And actually the Brazilian military, might surprise you to know this, are a fairly pacific force. They since the dictatorship, they've rather reconfigured themselves as like a civil contingency disaster relief type operation.
I didn't know that.
They don't fight, well, they're not like Colombia, where the Colombian military's been fighting guerrilla wars with FARC for 30, 40 years. Brazil, the military don't really do that. And they're certainly not going to get dragged into a coup. You know, they're non-political generals. And I would say that's one source of trouble for him. And then the other one, 200 of the biggest Brazilian bankers and businessmen, you know, wrote to him saying that his handling of the pandemic was deplorable. So that therefore leaves him with his political core base, which is even middle-class evangelical Christians. That's his core constituency, is evangelical Christians.
Right.
Actually, the relationship between religious people and populism is very, very underexplored. There's one book I can think of that's quite good about it, but the way in which, you know, different religious groups, well, look at evangelical Christians in the United States with Trump. Yeah. And to be completely fair to Trump, I mean, I can't stand Donald Trump, who's, you know, he's the ultimate creation of the television age. But to be entirely fair to him, you know, his Operation Warp Speed, as he called it, he did put $18 billion into the whole vaccine production process, literally from the syringes and the glass vials down to the, you know, the drug companies. And that is one of the reasons why Biden is in a position to, you know, vaccinate vast numbers of people. They, you know, they're doing it on a stellar basis. Plus the fact, which again will be underreported, is that Biden has adopted a strict America First policy. So there's no export of vaccines from the United States at all until they're all vaccinated. So I wouldn't entirely, you know, blame. I mean, Trump did some appalling things and was appalling in his attitude towards the virus. But nonetheless, in taking that decision, he made a very good decision. Whereas the money that the EU put into it, which I think was 2.8 billion euros into vaccine production, was woefully inadequate. They just didn't put enough money into it.
Is that that's just because the capabilities are different?
What?
Oh, sorry. Isn't that just because their capabilities are different? Surely the US has more invest in.
Well, the Americans can move faster and you know, cut corners more and do all sorts. And of course, they've got massive drug companies. But I just think that the EU messed that one up rather. The other thing, which is rather a technical point, but when it came to negotiating the contracts, which is quite surprising. I mean, if you think of America as a land, you know, dominated by lawyers. I mean, you hardly dare breathe in America in case you get a lawsuit. oddly enough, they cut right through all the questions of liability in case people became sick or died. Whereas the European Union, when it was doing the contract negotiations, and this is different from what happened in this country, actually in the UK, they spent weeks arguing about who would be liable if anybody was injured or damaged by the vaccine, about liability questions. And that, in a way, also held up the production of, swift production of vaccines. The British, of course, didn't even hardly consider that as an issue, and got their own very tight contract with AstraZeneca, which explains a lot, and the EU didn't. And also the EU, of course, at the same time, they accepted some extraordinary formulation in the AstraZeneca contract, which was that they would accept the company's best efforts. That's the killer phrase, best efforts. Because, of course, how did you know? They hadn't told you whether a factory in Germany or Belgium or the Netherlands actually wasn't in a state to produce vaccines at all, that you'd have to put a lot of money in and ramp it up.
Yeah. That's I didn't know that was the wording. That's quite shocking, actually. That's
yeah. Whereas you can't see the contracts the British did with AstraZeneca. They haven't been released.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it is all very murky waters. But any positive note we could end on? Not that isn't positive, but I did feel like there was some really interesting comments towards the end about sort of the not demise, but like you said, politics can be quite cyclical, and populism just seems to be waning slightly. And I just wondered if you had any.
What you've got to. I take great heart from the fact. This is a fact I take great heart from, and I only found it out quite recently, that the ratings figures of American cable news channels have collapsed since Joe Biden became president. They've collapsed because he's not on television every night. He's not making outrageous statements. His Twitter feed looks like somebody, I mean, I follow it, but he looks like somebody else writes it, and it's very anodyne. And really, all you want from government, I see the problem with populism is they're constantly in your face and in your ears. Yeah. They are constantly present. That's part of what they do. And I quite like what Biden represents, which is sort of dull competence. And although he's actually surprised me on several things, but he's competent, he's normal, he takes an interest in people, and above all, he knows the utility of silence. He knows when to keep his mouth shut. That, he did one press conference recently. I watched it live, and he was 6 or 7 weeks into power before he gave a single press conference. It was very orderly. He gave very good answers, and after exactly 1 hour, he said, "Well, I'm afraid," he said, "I'd love to stand here and talk to you forever, but I've got to go and take a Zoom call with the heads of the European Union and the political leaders." And off he went. He just shuffled out, and I thought, yes, that's the way to do it. And we ought to get more used to that. And when we see these people saying outrageous things, just in order, half the things that the UK government or some of these MPs come out with is entirely designed to capture the news agenda for 24 hours, to create a little sensation. If we all know that, we should just tune out of it. Just tune out of the whole damn thing.
True. I must admit, I fall foul to this because I have BBC breaking news updates on my phone.
Why?
So I get the little. I know. I don't know. I just feel like because there's news all the time, I need to know immediately.
Do you really need to know that somebody's unearthed a Viking treasure trove that a wild dog has attacked a granny and killed her? Do you really need to know this?
That is honestly the updates that I get. It really is. It'll be like breaking news: Boris Johnson to hold the press conference for the COVID update.
But I'm very. When I went to Romania, to the Raciu thing, there was a conference about journalism, and I was really optimistic after watching all these young journalists. They weren't young, but they were in their 20s, 30s, 40s. I came away feeling incredibly uplifted. First of all, by their intelligence. It was very refreshing. They were very unlike a lot of English journalists I know, or Scottish ones. And they were just really interesting, and they were working in a complex industry in their countries where all sorts of corrupt oligarchs, and governments have got their lock on the media. But these people were actually thinking, how do we get round this, and how are we going to do this in a different way? And I thought this was really, really encouraging. I mean, the other thing with you were asking me about how does one defeat populism, which is it's a difficult question to answer. First of all, what Biden's doing is extremely smart, which is pouring a lot of money into people's lives, to make real improvements in their lives and giving them a chance, whether it's the recovery fund or whether it's his huge infrastructure project. These are sensible things to do. And then secondly, he's making no bones about the fact that the people who are going to pay for this are very rich people. So as he said, that nobody earning less than $400,000 a year will see a tax increase. Nobody earning less than $400,000 is a lot of money. So nobody earning less than that will ever get a cent of a tax increase. This is very very sensible. So I would say that that's a very good way to go. The other thing I think is quite important, and maybe in Romania and other places it's important, is that you have to find a politically neutral way of going after corrupt people with the ferocity that the American legal system goes after them. I mean, America's got many, many bad things about it, but the way in which they go after corporate corruption is a wonder to behold. I mean, they really are going to put you in prison for a very long time. If you look back at Enron and all this sort of stuff, they go after you, and they've got people with power to do it. And I think somehow anti-corruption, which is something that would resonate with people, provided it's detached from the political party system. Because what can happen is that if a party gets into power, they will direct that machinery against businessmen or whatever connected to their opponents. So you have to find a way of having it quite politically neutralized, so it can't be tampered with. And it's almost, like the American district attorneys or something. They will just, they're not being leaned on by politicians. They just identify a target and go after it.
Yeah, I think that was the downfall of the impeachment trials in the Senate, wasn't it? Because it was just a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
They would claim it to be rightfully so, because he was breaking the law, but then obviously on the other side, they just say it was politicized and there was no basis behind it. You can't move forward.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to thank you so much for your time.
That's my pleasure.